Cara. I appreciate it. Thank you, attendees as well. Again, my name is Dave Johnson. I'm Senior Technical Director here at Ansible. And today I'd like to share a few slides with you in a demonstration of Ansible and Ansible Tower. I'd be happy, as Cara mentioned, be happy to take any questions that you may have. Please feel free to send those in via chat, and we should have plenty of time to catch up on any questions at closer to the end of the presentation here. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. And with that, let's begin. So I'm going to share a few slides. If we're unable to see any slides or my screen, please, moderators, Cara, Adele, please do let me know. Let's go ahead and get going. So Ansible was started as an open source project about 4.5 years ago by a guy by the name of Michael DeHaan. Now, Michael is pretty well known in the open source community and is quote-unquote internet famous because he has developed a number of very successful open source projects in his career, right? Number one of which was Cobbler for bare metal provisioning a number of years ago, and he's done a number of other very large open source projects since then. Most of those open source projects have been dedicated towards resolving problems in IT, particularly IT automation. And that's, of course, absolutely where Ansible comes from and fits in. So Ansible was started by Michael really in reaction to the complexity of a lot of the open source and commercial tools out there with regard to IT automation. The tools in the configuration management space and the application deployment space and just general IT automation tools. Michael found a lot of those to be very complicated to learn, to adopt, and really to use over their lifetime in IT. And so for a lot of reasons, a lot of organizations, a lot of very large enterprises really do nothing. They don't adopt those tools. They use shell scripts and primitive techniques and throw more humans at their IT problems to avoid that complexity. So where Ansible comes in is to eliminate that complexity and to provide a generic IT automation solution that's broadly applicable to configuration management, IT application deployment, orchestration, and provisioning, but to do it in a way that's broadly accessible to everyone in IT. So Ansible was started about 4.5 years ago as an open source project with these principles in mind of being simple, agentless, and powerful. About 2.5 years ago, we started the company around Ansible. And I'll talk more about that, and I'll talk more about our commercial products as well. But first, let me continue to tell you a little bit about Ansible. So Ansible is a 100% open source command line tool, right? Freely available. You can download Ansible from your favorite Linux distribution, from the upstream Python repositories, or directly from the source, directly from GitHub as well. It's 100% open source. It's a command line tool, and it's very powerful. It does lots of things in IT automation that I'll describe in detail here. But it's really easy to use and really easy to get started with. Number one, Ansible is very simple. Ansible's interface, what you write with Ansible, is what we call a playbook. And a playbook is an automation script that you write and use with Ansible to accomplish IT automation tasks, anything, again, from config management to application deployment. The Ansible playbook, this IT automation script that you write, is written in YAML, right? Y-A-M-L, if you're not familiar with it. YAML is a markup language. YAML is not a domain-specific language. It's not really a programming language, right? It's not Python or Ruby or something that complicated. It's actually very simple, human-readable markup language that you can use then to describe IT automation tasks. You don't need to be a Python or Ruby programmer or be a programmer at all. You don't really need to have any special coding skills. And it's the YAML playbook itself is very human-readable and very easy to understand. Tasks execute from beginning to end, top to bottom, in order. There's no crazy dependency reordering or anything like that. No guesswork in figuring out what the script is trying to accomplish. It's very straightforward. Generally, technical folks get started with Ansible in a matter of hours because it's so easy to use because of the YAML structure of the playbook. So it's not a matter of days or weeks in learning the technology and becoming productive or useful with it, but rather a matter of hours, really. And so in addition to that, Ansible is agentless. And this is a big difference between Ansible and other IT automation tools that are out there, both proprietary and open source. Ansible leverages standard industry tools and technologies to accomplish its work. It doesn't require an agent. You don't have to go install an agent or client software on every one of the hosts, Linux, Unix, Mac, or Windows hosts that you wish to manage. Ansible, for Linux, Unix, and Macs, talks OpenSSH, right? So it utilizes OpenSSH, opens an OpenSSH connection, transmits code over that connection, and does work, right? For Windows, it uses WinRM and Remote PowerShell. And for a lot of technologies like cloud technologies, virtualization platforms, network devices, load balancers, etc., Ansible talks native APIs. So when there's not an SSH interface, Ansible talks to a native API in a lot of cases to get work done. So with all of that, there's generally no software to install and manage on your clients, on your hosts, right? You don't need to have anything other than SSH and Python for your Linux and Unix hosts, and you don't need anything other than WinRM and PowerShell, Remote PowerShell, on your Windows hosts. And Ansible opens that connection and executes the playbook that you've written in YAML, as we discussed. Now that playbook, inside that playbook, you're going to interface or use a number of what we call modules. And these Ansible modules are included with Ansible. They come with Ansible, and they're basically tools in a toolkit, a reference library, if you will, of different interfaces that you can utilize in an Ansible playbook. And by that I mean modules that do things like install packages, copy files, manage users, all the way up to very high-level tasks like provisioning hosts in a cloud, private or public cloud platform, provisioning hosts in VMware, for example, or Amazon or OpenStack, talking to load balancers and firewalls and switches. All of these things are handled by what we call these modules. And there's about 350 of these modules that are included with Ansible, that we ship with Ansible and allow you to use in your playbook. And so when you launch a playbook, the Ansible modules themselves are transmitted over that SSH or WinRM connection. They execute on the remote hosts, and then they close the connection and get out of the way, right, and tear that down. They don't leave anything behind. So there's no agent, that you have to continuously manage, patch, worry about the security vulnerabilities of, or anything like that. Again, it's simply SSH and Python or WinRM and PowerShell, and you leverage the existing set of modules that we provide to do work on those hosts. Now, in addition to that, because it's on the outside looking in, it's agentless, it's a push-based architecture rather than a pull-based agent architecture. Because of that, it's really easy to do a lot of orchestration with Ansible. So not just traditional configuration management, right, of managing operating system and middleware, but also to do real application deployment, right, to layer your own custom applications on top of your application stack using Ansible. And to do orchestration, again, to be able to, as part of a deployment or update in your data center, to talk to all of the elements of the data center as part of that, not just installing software on a host, but rather also talking to the load balancers and firewalls and switches and cloud services as I've described. So we call that orchestration, of being able to take actions on hosts based on the result of an action from another host, doing things like a rolling update, for example, through your environment. All of those sorts of patterns are very easy to accomplish with Ansible because of the push-based architecture outside looking in. And so again, Ansible is being adopted rapidly in the marketplace right now as the #1 tool in IT automation because it's the simplest to adopt and the simplest to use. Certainly we benefit from the timing of the industry, right? There's a lot of very large and medium-sized enterprises in the industry that are just now looking to adopt IT automation. They've adopted maybe agile development practices over the last decade to speed up their delivery of applications. They've adopted virtualization and maybe even cloud to speed up their delivery and provisioning of infrastructure. And so now they're looking for IT automation to glue all of that together, right? To improve their efficiencies and delivery even further. And so there's a lot of folks are out there looking right now for IT automation, this IT automation glue, so to speak. And Ansible is being adopted in that way because again, it's so easy to use. It's simple, it's agentless, it's powerful. It's very easy to adopt and very easy to maintain over time. So as as organizations continue to adopt quote-unquote DevOps best practices, part of that is adopting automation tools, and Ansible is well poised for that because of its simplicity. And so Ansible is becoming the de facto language of quote-unquote DevOps. Because an Ansible playbook is so easy to read, it's so human readable, really anyone with any technical knowledge can understand these things without prior Ansible expertise or experience. Because of that, we're seeing Ansible playbooks being used everywhere throughout an environment, through all stages of release and across teams. And so sometimes Ansible is adopted first in operations, because operations has a particular automation pain point that they need to resolve. Sometimes it's adopted first in development. But in any case, what we see is Ansible growing inside an organization and spreading through all the stages of release and across all the teams. Particularly, we see a lot of the reuse of the same playbook through stages of release, right? So you may write a playbook in operations to describe the deployment of a software stack or a complete environment, and we see using that playbook all the way back in test and QA and pushing that book all the way back into development, using the same automation script, if you will, to deploy the software stack the same way every time consistently, but through all the stages of release. And this is really eliminating a lot of errors that organizations have due to inconsistencies between stages of release, right? Rather than using a different automation script or no automation at all and installing software stacks in development entirely differently from how they're installed in production operations, Ansible can help eliminate that and drive organizational consistency for releases using the same playbook through all the stages of release, deploying software exactly the same way every time. And of course, you can abstract your playbook in such a way to counter or capture, environmental differences, right? Where you may deploy to a small hosts in development than you do in operations. That's okay. You can account for that in the playbook and again, still use the same automation to deploy throughout all of your stages of release. This has really helped organizations and clients build these repeatable build libraries, right? A build library that contains automation for every software stack that you might want to deploy in your organization and be able to, at a push of a button, deploy that software stack at a particular version anywhere at a particular time. And that's really what Ansible is helping a lot of companies build. So again, Ansible itself is cross-platform. We've been supporting Windows in addition to Linux, Unix, Macs for Windows for about the last year and a half, and of course Linux and Unix since inception. For Windows, again, we're still agentless and simple. You still write a YAML playbook for Windows. There's no difference from a user's perspective. Under the hood, the modules that we execute on Windows will be PowerShell rather than Python for Linux and Unix, but there's no difference. That's transparent to the end user. And of course, the transport that we use in Windows is WinRM and remote PowerShell rather than SSH. We don't require SSH on Windows. Microsoft has talked about adding SSH to Windows recently, and so that may change in the long term. But for now, it is WinRM, and we built that in conjunction with Microsoft. Microsoft is a powerful, strong partner of Ansible, and of course, Red Hat recently announced a partnership with Microsoft as well. Of course, Red Hat being the parent company now of Ansible, as I'm sure you all know. So Microsoft is a strong partner of Ansible, and they actually contribute code to the Ansible open source community around, for example, Azure support. And so worked in conjunction with Microsoft to develop our Windows support as well. And so Ansible is absolutely cross-platform. Lots of clients use it to manage everything in their environment. Very useful for not only modern, very modern cloud deployments of Linux, but also legacy Unix environments as well. Given that it's just SSH and a Python stack, very easy to use Ansible to manage your legacy Unix environments as well. And so I mentioned that Ansible does a lot of different things. And so when you're looking at a tool like Ansible, you'll have to decide where your pain is and what problem you're trying to solve, and then fit Ansible, if it fits, into that solution space, right? So Ansible does a lot of different things. It comes from the configuration management world, so it does configuration management very well. And you might use it to replace something like Chef, Puppet, or CF Engine, or in lieu of using those tools. However, Ansible does a lot more. It also does application deployment and as I mentioned, multi-tier orchestration. So there's certainly cases where you might continue to use a configuration management solution or tool that you already have and use Ansible to solve your pain around application deployment or orchestration. And we have customers that do exactly that. If you have a 3-year investment in an existing open source or commercial config management tool and that works great for you and you don't have pain around that, then that's fine. You know, where is your pain? Is it in application deployment? Perhaps Ansible can help you there. So these tools do play together nicely, and Ansible was designed to play together nicely with other tools as well, and to be able to plug in. So happy to talk about in more detail, but you can certainly replace or augment, you know, at your discretion. I mentioned that Ansible, of course, itself. I'll just reiterate that Ansible itself is a 100% open source tool. Again, you can grab it from your favorite Linux distro, from Python upstream, or from the from GitHub directly. There's more than 350 modules that are shipping now with Ansible, as I mentioned, and I'll show you a quick snapshot of that here momentarily. And those, again, those modules cover everything from low-level tasks like package management, user management, all the way up to very high-level tasks like interfacing with cloud providers, for example. Ansible itself, as an open source project, is the #1 open source project in IT automation in this space. It has more contributors than any other open source project, and we're very proud of that. That enables us to react very quickly and very nimbly to the industry and to the market, and that means that there's, again, lots of new modules coming in all the time from the open source community. And I mentioned Microsoft as a member of that, but there are a number of other very large vendors, important vendors, that are a part of that community as well. And a lot of the contributions, a lot of the modules that we ship with Ansible actually come from vendor contributions, right? So I mentioned Microsoft contributing Azure. We also get contributions from, for example, Rackspace around their cloud, around Google Compute Engine. Google has contributed the code there, and just tons and tons of other contributions throughout the module space from lots of open source contributors and lots of vendors as well. We do hold our user fest. I was going to say annual, but it's actually 3 times a year now, Ansible Fest, and we do those in New York, San Francisco, and London. And so our next one is coming up actually next week in San Francisco. Probably too short of notice for you all. If any of you are going to be there, that'd be great. But we're also doing, going to be back in London. I believe that's coming up in the early part of 2016. I think around the February-March time frame. That hasn't been announced yet. So look for Ansible Fest out in London in that time frame. And that's generally it's a user conference, so it's primarily lots of users of Ansible that are presenting how they're using Ansible and in what ways, and best practices there. So very, very useful. Let me tell you just quickly about a few clients and customers and how they use Ansible and Ansible Tower, and then I'll talk to you in detail about Ansible Tower and give you a demonstration of that as well. And so Ansible's adopted throughout the industry, all over different sorts of verticals, different sorts of businesses, all different sizes of businesses as well. Everything from very tiny startups deploying web applications to Amazon, all the way to very large enterprises like CSC, Apple Computer, Nike, for example, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, for example, using Ansible for various tasks from config management to application deployment. Very often in application deployment, so Nike deploying the Nike Plus software as a service application with Ansible on an hourly basis. Apple deploying the Apple online store, for example, using Ansible, for example. Splunk I mentioned here. Splunk actually utilizes Tower, which I'll show you in a few moments. And Tower is our RESTful API and web UI for Ansible. So I'll drill into that in lots of detail. But Splunk uses that to provide a self-service interface to their developers. So in the past, Splunk's developers went to a ticket system and opened a ticket with IT operations to get a new environment, a new development environment stood up. And that generally took on the order of 5 or 6 days for that environment to get stood up. Now they utilize Ansible and Ansible Tower. And Tower provides a web UI where their developers go in and press a button to deploy an Ansible playbook that launches that development environment for them. Now, the developers didn't write the playbook. That was written by operations, and they're actually not Ansible experts. They don't use Ansible on a day-to-day basis, and so they leverage Tower for that, which again provides them a web UI that abstracts the command line tool away from them, so they don't have to be experts in Ansible. They need a new development environment. They just go into Tower, they press the button, they go walk away, get coffee, come back for a few minutes later, and they have a new environment. And so using a combination of Ansible and Ansible Tower, Splunk was able to provide a self-service interface to their developers. And I'll show you Tower. There's lots of different use cases like that. Juniper Networks uses Ansible Tower to deploy their own, from an operations perspective, to deploy their applications to both OpenStack and Amazon. Red Hat, of course, uses Ansible and Tower to automate patching at the operating system level for them of thousands of servers internally. They also use Ansible to deploy OpenShift, which is, of course, their platform as a service offering. And as I'm sure you all know, Red Hat acquired Ansible here just about a few weeks ago, just about a month ago. And then, a customer like J.Crew, totally different space, not a technology company, right, a retail, and they are deploying and building their mobile site and their website, their e-commerce site, I should say, jcrew.com, through with Ansible as well. Now, that all said, we've talked a lot about Ansible, open source. I've mentioned a few times that it's 100% open source and freely available. It's full-featured. We don't hold back any features from it in order to, sell a product or anything like that. What we do sell is Ansible Tower, and Tower does not replace Ansible. It is not a commercial or enterprise version of Ansible, but rather Tower layers on top of Ansible and provides a number of values that you just don't get from the command line, right? That just don't make sense in a command line tool, right? Things like role-based access control to control who can do what, things like scheduling of jobs, things like push-button deployment like Splunk uses, for example. So I will switch to my web browser and show you a demonstration of Tower, and we'll get into, we'll take a look at that particular product and what it can offer as well. Again, that's a commercial product that will offer support for open source Ansible through that Tower subscription. I'm going to switch to my web browser so I can show you that. I'm also going to take advantage of my web browser here to show you some playbook examples before we dive into Tower as well. So let me just switch over here to my web browser. That should be coming across okay. And before we dive into Tower, just real fast, I'm going to take a quick peek over at docs.ansible.com is where the documentation lives. For getting started with Ansible, there's a Getting Started link here that will help you install Ansible and get started with that. And I just want to give you a quick glance at an example playbook here so you get a sense of what that looks like. We'll talk through that playbook, we'll look at the modules, and then we'll switch over and look at Tower as well and run a few of these. So this is what we're looking at right here on the screen is an example playbook out of our documentation. I've got it highlighted here on the screen. So it's only about 20 lines or so, very small, very simple, and the technical users in the audience can probably figure out what this playbook is doing before I even walk you through it. Again, this is YAML. This is the YAML syntax, and it's very human readable here, so it's pretty easy to get a grasp of what this playbook is accomplishing. And again, Ansible, I sometimes compare it to sitting in between something like shell scripting and programming, right? It's certainly easier to read and more maintainable than a shell script over time, but certainly as powerful as something like Python or Ruby, but a lot easier to to read immediately as well. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. The playbook here, I'll just walk you through it. Very simple and straightforward. As you can imagine, it's installing the Apache web server on a set of hosts for us. And playbooks can be this simple, just doing a few tasks, or they can be very advanced, and you can deploy an entire data center full of multi-tier web applications, for example, using a single playbook. So you can get very advanced with it, but this is a very simple example. The first thing that we do is we iterate over a host's declaration here. So all we're doing here is saying this playbook is going to run over a set of hosts that we've grouped into a group called web servers. We give the playbook, when we run the playbook, we separately provide the lists of hosts to run against, right? So on the command line, we would say run against this set of host names or IP addresses, or in Tower, we'll keep that in a database, and I'll show you what that looks like. But in any case, this playbook is expecting to run against a set of hosts that are grouped into a group called web servers. And it's important to note that this playbook, we could run this against one host or 1 million hosts at the same time, right? Any number is perfectly feasible here. There's some scale limitations according to how much RAM is in the host that the Ansible host we're running from, but otherwise there could be any number of web servers here that we're going to run this playbook against simultaneously in parallel. That's the way that Ansible works. So we're going to run this against a set of hosts. First, we're going to declare a couple of variables, and we're just declaring HTTP port and max clients here. We're going to use that later. In a more advanced playbook, you can separate these sorts of declarations out, of course, into their own files, and that is the best practice. But in a simple playbook like this, we can have it all in one. In this case, we're going to SSH into a set of Linux hosts here with this playbook, so we're going to use the remote user root. Now, it's not required to use root with Ansible. In fact, you can use whatever user you want. You can SSH in as whatever user, and then you just need the right privileges to execute the set of tasks that you want to execute in the playbook for that user. So if you need to escalate using sudo or su or power broker or some other mechanism, that's totally acceptable, and you can absolutely do that. You can do that for the entire playbook, run that through sudo, for example, or for just the individual tasks. So you've got a lot of control over, who's running these tasks remotely on your hosts. In this case, we're just going to use root, and that's fine in this simple example. And then the playbook is going to loop then over this set of tasks on each and every host that we've asked it to here. So for each and every host, we're going to fire off each of these tasks. The name for each task is just an optional human readable comment, right? And it's nice to have to comment where you're at in the playbook. It also shows up in Tower, and so if we have a failure when we're running the playbook, we can use that to correlate, where we're at in the playbook where we failed, for example. Here, we're invoking the yum module to install Apache at the latest version, right? And so this is one of those modules. This yum module here is one of those modules I was talking about. There's about 350 of these modules, as I mentioned, and they do all kinds of different work for us. They're built-in Python and PowerShell programs built into Ansible. So when you install Ansible, you get all of these things. You can use them in the playbook to do work. And think of them just, again, as a reference library of different interfaces that you can do here. So we're interfacing with yum, the package manager, and we're not just opening an SSH connection and invoking yum, but rather this is a little Python program that we're transmitting from the host here over to the web server and then executing. And this program is going to ask yum locally on that host, is Apache installed at the latest version? If it's not, please do so. If it is, then we skip this task, right, and we move to the next task. And in that way, it's safe generally to run these playbooks over and over again on hosts. They'll only do the work that's required, right? They'll only do the work that's necessary here. So if Apache's already installed the latest version, we skip that step and move on to the next one. And then the next step, of course, is just to write an Apache config file. We're going to use the built-in template module for that, which uses Jinja 2 style templating to lay down a templated config file in the right location for us. And as you can imagine, this is the step where we're replacing the values of these variables inside that templated file and laying them down accordingly. And again, if that exists and the checksum is correct, then we'd move to the next task, which is to, of course, make sure that Apache is running and enabled at boot time. All of these tasks execute from top to bottom, beginning to end, with only one exception. The restart of Apache only happens at the end and only happens once. So if there were multiple tasks here that required an Apache restart, by default, we would only do that once, and we would wait till the end of the playbook to do that. So that's to be efficient, right? So we don't have to restart Apache 10 times just because, where we could have just restarted it once at the end. So that's the default behavior there. But that's an entire playbook, right? Again, we could run this against 10,000 hosts, and it would happily install Apache on all 10,000 of those hosts pretty quickly as well. And on command line, you would just run that through the command line and specify, the set of hosts to target, and you'd be on your way. So that's an example playbook, pretty straightforward. If you were writing one for Windows or Unix, it would look very similar, right? You would just be invoking different package managers. You wouldn't be invoking yum necessarily. Going back to the modules, I mentioned there's about 350 or so of these modules. They're all documented under the module index, so you can go to Ansible's documentation and take a look at that at any time. And again, there's very low-level modules, like we were using the yum module to install packages. So there's lots of packaging modules for all of your various operating systems here: Windows, Linux, Unix, Mac, etc. And then there's high-level modules like the cloud modules, for example, that enable you to interface with Zen Server or Amazon. Lots of modules for Amazon, all the Amazon services, Azure, VMware, OpenStack, Google, you name it. Ansible can probably talk to it and do real work. At the very low level, there's also script and command modules. So if there's not a module for something that you're trying to accomplish, you can always run an arbitrary command on the command line through Ansible. You can also execute an arbitrary script with any interpreter through Ansible as well. So lots of low-level things that you can do there as well. All right, now I'm going to, I see the questions are piling up over there. Very good, excellent. I'm going to tackle those here momentarily. Keep them coming. I'm going to switch to Ansible Tower here and give you just a quick 10-minute or so demonstration of Ansible Tower, and then I'll start tackling these questions. And we can certainly go in any direction that you folks like today. So that was Ansible, right? We looked really fast at Ansible. We talked about it at a high level. We looked at an example playbook, and I can show you how to run that through the command line as well. Let's take a moment to look at Tower. Tower is what we're looking at here in my web browser now. I'm running Tower, by the way, on a VM here locally. Tower is on-premise software. You're going to install it in your data centers, in your environments. It can be anything, physical, virtual, cloud, we don't care. But it's something that you run in your data centers. We don't host Ansible Tower. Of course, Tower keeps all of your keys and credentials, and we don't want that information at Ansible.com. So we don't host Tower. It's on-premise software. Tower is a Django application, so it runs in Django on a Linux host and uses a Postgres database to store all of its data, as well as a MongoDB to cache certain bits of data as well. So that's the software stack. It is, if you go out to Ansible.com/tower, you can grab a free trial of it. In fact, let me just pull that up here quickly. So you go to Ansible.com, there's a 20-minute demo video there and a free trial. So feel free to go out and grab Ansible Tower. It's installed with an Ansible playbook, by the way. So it's a really easy, simple installation as well. Get up and running pretty fast. If you're not familiar with Ansible yet, then I'm going to point you at Ansible.com/getting started, which is another great resource. And this is going to help you. Oh, let me find the right URL for that. Let me find the right URL. I'll come back to that, and I'm going to point you to some particular getting started bits there. All right, back to Tower. So Tower is not a commercial or enterprise version of Ansible. I mentioned that earlier, right? Tower layers on top of Ansible and provides a framework for consuming an open source command line tool in your enterprise, right? So it offers features that you just don't get from the command line, that just don't make sense in the command line. So the things that I'll show you here specifically will be, number one, role-based access control, right? So you can explicitly control who can run what playbooks against what hosts. Number two, push-button deployment. And this is, again, what Splunk uses to provide a self-service interface to their developers. So you can launch playbooks with the push of a button without any knowledge of the Ansible command line. Number three, the aggregation of logs, right? So I have an audit trail of all of the playbooks that I've ever been run through Tower, and I can audit that information. And finally, and probably the most important feature, is the RESTful API. So I'll show you that at the end here, but everything that I can do point and click through the UI, I can do through the API. The UI is really just a wrapper for the API. So just keep that in mind. Here we're looking at the dashboard for Ansible Tower. This is a fresh installation of Ansible Tower. I installed it 2 days ago, so it's pretty new, relatively new here. So I immediately see a quick graph of all of my deployments over the last month or the last week or 24 hours there, and I've timed out, so let me log back in while we were chatting. So I've got all of my deployments of the last, say, week, for example, when I installed this tower back on the 8th, so no history before that. You can see I'm managing 38 hosts with this particular tower instance at the moment, 21 of which have some failed jobs, and I can drill down into any of these hot links and get more information about any of this about any of these statistics. I can see my most recent job runs on the lower right, and these are going to be primarily Ansible playbook runs. Tower also synchronizes with upstream inventory sources like Amazon, like VMware, like OpenStack to get the list of hosts to manage. So you'll see those as jobs as well. And Tower also synchronizes with version control repositories, right? So the best practice is keep your playbooks and config data in version control, and Tower will just pull that in. So you'll see those as jobs here as well. Let's dive into the role-based access control real fast here. And so I'm logged in, by the way, as an admin user, so I have access to everything. I can see everything. But depending on what user you're logged in as, of course, in Tower, your view will change, right, depending on what you have permission to. So with Tower, you can create as many users as you like, and I've got a few here. And these users can come from, by the way, LDAP or Active Directory. So you don't have to create these users by hand or by API. You can synchronize directly to AD or LDAP, and Tower will authenticate against those platforms, but also it will automatically create users here in Tower for you if like an AD user were to log in for the very first time, for example. So you can synchronize with LDAP or AD for user management, and you can also group your users together in teams. And team grouping can also come from LDAP or AD as well. And of course with teams, you can have as many as you like here. I've got development, operations, and QA. And each of these teams has its own set of permissions. Each team and each user, I should say, has its own set of permissions. And so this is a scalable way to manage permissions across lots and lots of users, for example, right? So either at the team level or at the user level, I can set these permissions and explicitly control exactly what users can do here. In this case, I'm giving the development team permission to run any playbooks from this Ansible examples project. Again, a project is just a version control repo of playbooks. And so I'm giving them permission to run any playbooks from Ansible examples and from Sandbox and run those out to the development inventory, my inventory of hosts that happen to be in development. And by the same token, I have an operations team that can run the same sets of playbooks. They can also run Ansible examples and my Sandbox project, but they only run these out to hosts in production, in my production inventory, right? So I've got my inventories are development, production, and QA, and based on those permission schemes that we just saw, I'm limiting my users and my teams to what sets of hosts they can see you know, in these different inventories. So each of these inventories has its own set of hosts. My production hosts are coming from Amazon in this particular case. My development hosts happen to be local VMs, and I've segregated those out into their own inventories and then permitted my users accordingly through that role-based access control. So if a production, a member of the operations team were to log in, they wouldn't see my development hosts at all. Much less be able to, you know, launch any playbooks against those. But again, I am letting the teams, the two teams, see the same projects, right? And that's because I want these teams, again, to use the same playbooks to deploy the software stacks the same way in both production and development. So by making those playbooks available to multiple teams, I can encourage reuse, collaboration, and again drive out errors due to inconsistencies. So my operations team, my development team are using the same playbooks. They're only permitted to deploy to the hosts they have permission to. And alongside that are credentials. Credentials are, of course, the secrets that you have to pass into Ansible in order to run a playbook, right? So if I'm running a playbook against, you know, a set of Linux hosts, I need an SSH key or password. I need a Windows password for my Windows hosts. If I'm talking to any of my different clouds, VMware or Amazon, for example, then I'll need authentication for those as well. Now, normally on the command line, the user has to pass those things in, right? The user has to know those things. The user has to know the SSH key or the password and be able to pass that to Ansible on the command line when Ansible is invoked, when the playbook is run. But here in Tower, we can actually abstract that away, right? So in Tower, we keep the key in Tower, encrypted, stored in the database. It's just not retrievable by anyone. So not even the admin user can reach out and get this key from Tower. It's encrypted in the database. It's not retrievable from the UI or the API or the database. So in this way, I can assign the key to, say, a user or a team, so we could assign it to our operations team, for example. And now anyone in operations can use this key to run a playbook. But they still can't see the key. They can't get the key out of Tower, and they wouldn't be able to use it out of band, to do something else. And that goes for all the sort of secrets that you might pass through Ansible. If you're using, say, sudo, for example, from a privilege escalation perspective, sudo or su, then you can pass the passwords in through Tower as well, and they'll be locked away. If you're using Ansible Vault, which is our encrypted data store, you can lock that password away as well. So any secrets that you might have to pass are not exposed to the actual end user. And that enables push button deployment, right? So now that the credentials are locked away, I can, under role-based access control, provide a menu of different playbooks, essentially, that a user can run and let them just come in here and press the button, to launch this, right? Or launch it via API. So by setting up the permissions, I can restrict this menu that we're seeing right here of these job templates. I can restrict this list to just the list that a user should be able to see based on permission, right? Whether they see the production deployments or the development deployments, etc. So this menu here that you can offer to your user would be restricted under that role-based access control. They would only see the templates that they have permission to. They can launch the template by pressing the button, and Tower will attach the credential accordingly, so they never see the credential either. And so in this way, you can provide a push-button interface, and that has a lot of different use cases. I mentioned the Splunk use case, where Splunk uses it to, as a self-service interface for developers. Rackspace uses it as a way of delegating responsibility to level 1 and level 2 technicians, for example. Again, anywhere where you might want to run a playbook without the user being an Ansible expert, right? Maybe the user didn't write the playbook, maybe they don't know how or don't care how to run it on the command line. You can give them this interface, and they can leverage Ansible without being an Ansible expert, right? So each one of these job templates simply captures all of the options you would normally pass on the command line, right? That's what they're doing here. So normally on the command line, you'd have to specify all of this information. You'd have to say, am I running this job in run mode or in check mode, which is a dry run mode for Ansible? What inventory of hosts am I targeting? What playbook do I want to run? What credentials do I need to run that playbook? Even overriding variables that are in the playbook itself, right? So if you've got variables in the playbook, you can override them here, right? Specify a different version of the application or an HTTP port number or a database password or whatever. You can override that in the template. You can also ask the end user for that information. Again, so if you're providing a self-service interface, your user may come in here, they may press the button, and you may ask them, as I'm doing here, questions and pass the values back down to the playbook, such as, what password do I want to use for the database this time, or what version of the application do I want to deploy? And so Tower has a built-in form builder. That was that dialog that we just saw pop up, a built-in form builder that allows us to build that form and ask the user those kind of questions and then pass their answers back down to the playbook. And so that's what we're doing there. So I just launched that playbook for us. It'll take a couple of minutes to kick off. I've got Tower first set up to go synchronize with my upstream inventory source before it runs the playbook. So it's going to go synchronize right now with Amazon, and then it's going to run this playbook for us. Now this particular playbook is quite a bit more advanced than the simple one that we were looking at a minute ago. This playbook actually not only it deploys Apache, but it deploys a complete multi-tier environment. So it deploys a couple of Apache web servers, a MySQL server. It also deploys an HA proxy load balancer and a Nagios monitoring server. And not only does it do all of that config management of installing the software and configuration, but then it actually deploys a web application for us. And then finally, it adds the web servers to the load balancing pool, and all of the hosts to Nagios. So that's an example of application deployment and orchestration on top of traditional config management. So Ansible and Ansible Tower are going to deploy the entire environment for me, at the end of which I'll have a couple of web servers load balanced attached to a database server. So Tower is going to aggregate the logs of all of that activity for us. So although if we were sitting at the command line running this, we'd be able to see similar logs as we're seeing here. As I mentioned before, those logs just go away when we're done on the command line, right? On the command line, there's no centralized logging at all. So if we all ran the same playbooks against the same host, we really have no idea of what each other did without something like Tower. Tower provides that centralized logging for us so that depending on our user permissions, we can come in and see the result of these playbook runs, even what others have done, and audit that, right? So Tower is going to run through and provide us lots of detail right now as it's live running through this. When it's done, we'll be able to go to the Jobs tab and see the result of that as well, just like I can see all of the other jobs that I've ever run since installing this new Tower a couple of days ago. So I've got something like 70 plus jobs here that I've run through this Tower installation over the last couple of days, and I can go audit this and look at any of this, right? So I can go to one of our previous jobs of running this exact same deployment here, and I can see the result of that. It looks like I did that earlier today, this morning. I'm on Eastern Standard Time, and it took about 11 minutes, and I can see that it was the user admin that actually launched this job earlier today with these particular parameters, including any parameter that was overridden or passed, right? Of course, I'm not exposing the password there, that's encrypted, but otherwise, any parameters that were passed into the playbook are being captured here. So we have this audit trail. We can always tell exactly what happened. Who did it? How was it launched? What parameters were passed to it? What the result was, right? You get a tremendous amount of detail on each one of these tasks from Tower. So if you wanted to drill in and see any one of these tasks, it's against any one of these hosts, you can see lots of detail about exactly what module in the playbook was being executed with what arguments, and of course the results and even the standard output. Here's the standard output of Yum installing these Nagios packages for us. And we also get the standard output as if we were sitting right at the command line. So if you're an Ansible command line user, you don't lose any of that info. All of that standard output is right here. And again, we keep this history around by default forever. You can clean it out, of course. And so that's really the third major value of Tower. I've talked about the aggregation of logs is what we just looked at. We talked about push button deployment. We're running a job now. And we looked at, of course, the role-based access control. So the last thing that I want to show you with Tower, and then we'll answer these questions here, is the API, right? So I mentioned that everything you can do point and click here, you can do via the API. The API is browsable at /API from a Tower URL. So you just drop right into /API. And it's pretty self-documenting as well. Just expand all of the question marks here to expand the descriptions. But any object that's inside of Tower is fair game for managing via the API. You can create, delete, update any of these objects through the API, so you can programmatically create lots of things. The most common use of the API is to launch jobs, right? And so it's a very common pattern to wire up continuous integration tools to Ansible through the Tower API, meaning you take a tool like Jenkins or Bamboo or TeamCity, any continuous integration tool, and you call out to the API at the end of your build to launch an Ansible playbook to deploy, right, to do your deploy task, whatever that may be. And so through the API, of course, you can get the API and list the jobs, but you can also post to the API to create a job, right? And you just need to pass in the job template ID number. So when you create your job templates in Tower, that gives you a human interface to press the button or schedule and launch a job as we just did, but it also, you can use the exact same job template and launch it programmatically through the API. So you get both a machine and human interface to that object. And so very easy to launch from a continuous integration. In fact, there's also a tool called Tower-CLI, which is a command line wrapper for the API for Tower. It's open source Python command line tool. You just drop it right onto your continuous integration host, and then you can tell it where Tower lives, and give it a username and password, and then it can happily launch jobs and monitor the result for you. Again, it's just a wrapper for the API just to make it convenient and easy for you to start doing this using continuous integration. But you can write your own API code as well. Now we got a few minutes remaining, so I want to make sure I answer these questions. So I'm going to, from a Tower perspective, I'm just going to leave that running and let that playbook continue, and we can answer questions about that as well. Meanwhile, let me drop into our interface here. Lots of great questions. So let's get first question. At some point we discussed the version of Python Ansible supports. Yep, Ansible is currently a 2.x Python application. It's not a Python 3 application. In the future, we are about to release Ansible 2.0, but that does not provide Python 3 support. It starts to get there, but we haven't done all of that work yet. And of course, all that happens in the open source community, so you can happily follow along, on GitHub and see all that work. But it's a lot of work, and we want to do it the right way. And we're always trying to preserve backwards compatibility with Ansible. So taking all that in mind, we're moving slowly but surely in that direction, definitely. How well does Ansible integrate with Red Hat Satellite? Great question. Red Hat just acquired the company just a few weeks ago, and so the integration will get better. Currently, the integration is such that you have basically what we call a dynamic inventory sync script for Red Hat Network Satellite within Ansible, and you can use that with Ansible Tower. So what do I mean by that? With Ansible and Ansible Tower, you can synchronize inventories to an upstream provider, right? Just like I'm doing here with Amazon, I'm synchronizing Tower with Amazon to pull in my production inventory, or you can do the same thing with Satellite. It's a custom script, it's not built into the UI, but it's there and you can use it. In the future, over the next year or so, Ansible and Tower and Satellite will be further integrated. You will likely see the ability for Satellite to call out to Tower through the API to invoke actions and vice versa. That's all in planning right now, but you can imagine that's a high priority for Red Hat, absolutely, to integrate Ansible with all of its products. Next question is, can Ansible update itself via same automation process? Yes. Ansible's a Python application. You can use Ansible to update itself. And of course, Tower is upgraded through the installer as well, so it's pretty straightforward. Next question, what about if I have different users for different hosts? Is there a way to specify that use particular username for login? Yeah, you can do that. Of course, it's a little bit more complex. In Tower, you would use a different credential for each host, which might get a little bit too complex. Another way to do that would be to affix a variable to an entire group of hosts. So for example, in an inventory you can have as many of these groups as you want, and any group can have variables attached to it. So for my Jenkins group, for example, I could have Ansible user, SSH user, equal to foo or something else, and that will override whatever user that I'm using for just this group of hosts. And I can set that on a per host basis as well. But using a different username for each host will. What do we got here? Let's see. Oh yeah, now in the playbook, which was your follow-up question to that same question, you don't have to specify the variable in Tower. You can also do it in the playbook itself. So you could say for this host use this username, for this host use this one, and you can even do that on an individual task basis. Yeah, you can specify the user inside the playbook, definitely. Can Ansible access iCloud? That one I'm not sure of off the top of my head. I'll have to follow up with me. By the way, everyone, I'm Dave at Ansible.com. So write that down and feel free to send me anything at all. I'm pretty technical. I'm Dave, D-A-V-E, at Ansible.com. So send me that question about iCloud. I don't know that one off the top of my head. Can you talk about the new blocks feature in Ansible 2.0? Yeah, just briefly. Ansible 2.0 is on its way. It's currently in beta. Second beta, I should say, and I do expect that to be released in the next few weeks here. But we don't have a specific ETA on that we can announce. And so there are a number of new features to Ansible 2.0, including try and accept blocks, which give you some more programming language-like functionality around exception clauses, basically, so that in addition to what you could already do, which is ignore errors on a task and then move on and do something else. You can do that in a little bit more programmatic way using try except clauses. There's a number of other features in there as well, like strategies, which is a nice way for controlling how Ansible simultaneously or in what order it connects to your hosts. Ansible has some default ways that it orders host connections, and you have a little bit of control over that today, but in Ansible 2.0 you get even broader control. Let's see, next question. Puppet offers a free 5-node version of Puppet Enterprise. We do the same thing with Tower, actually. So with Ansible Tower, let me go back to, where is that? Here we go. Yep. With Ansible Tower, you can get a free trial of Tower, and Tower is also free for up to 10 nodes, right? So you can use Tower free for up to 10 nodes without paying anything at all. So, and that's beyond trial. Let's see, what else do we have? Do most enterprise users run Ansible on a server? Is it recommended to run on a server so that multiple teams, users can access Ansible, etc.? Well, of course, I'm biased towards Tower, right? And so we would say that Tower is that solution for your particular problem there. The problem being multiple teams, users that can access Ansible on a single server. That's really what Tower is designed for. For people that don't use Tower, yeah, it is common to host Ansible on a server somewhere, but it's not necessary at all, right? You can run Ansible from your laptop, and that's really why Tower exists, is because of the complexities of not having a centralized server. Next question is, does Ansible or Tower integrate with commercial CMDB tooling like ServiceNow or Atrium to create report on YAML config data as config items in a CMDB? Not natively. We have had customers do ServiceNow integrations, mostly on the continuous integration side, kicking off using ServiceNow as a catalog to then provide self-service to users to kick off jobs through Tower. So I haven't seen it integrate quite at that level. It's certainly doable. It would probably require some coding from the ServiceNow side rather than the Tower side. So we haven't done any of that work as of yet, although we do have some partnership with ServiceNow. That is definitely possible, but I haven't seen that specific integration as of yet, no. Next question, is Tower available for free on commercial use for more than 30 days? Yeah, if you want to trial longer than 30 days, then you just need to contact us directly through sales. So again, you can hit me up at dave@ansible.com, or you can contact us at info@ansible.com. If you already are in contact with sales, then that's the way to go, and we're happy to provide longer than 30-day trials for Tower. Yeah, definitely. Next question, how does Ansible handle ordering of tasks? Puppet is quite painful. Yes, Puppet is quite painful in that area. You're absolutely right. And so I think I've covered that one already, but it's top to bottom. There's no dependency reordering. The only thing that happens out of order is handlers like that Apache handler to restart Apache at the end. Next question is there any way of configuring jump servers to access? Yep, absolutely. Ansible and Tower both honor the SSH configuration. So just configure SSH normally as you would for a jump host, telling it where the jump host is when you're trying to SSH to that band of network of that hosts, and Ansible and Tower will both honor that happily, absolutely. There's no other configuration that you have to do, nothing specific to Ansible or to Tower. There's a question about Google Cloud support. Yep, Ansible and Tower both support Google Cloud natively. There's a bunch of modules that Google has provided, and Tower can synchronize directly with Google Cloud. There's 3 more questions, but I recognize we're at the top of the hour, so I'll pass back to our moderators graciously. If we have time, I'm happy to answer these last 3 questions or anything else, but certainly respective of your time today.
Hi, Dave. Yes, you can continue and carry on the rest of the questions now if you'd like to.
Perfect. Yeah, it looks like there's only 3 left. So next question is, how would you manage different config parameters for different environments? The best practice there is to abstract. I abstracted out the database used for that. I also abstracted out the repository from where I'm going to deploy the application version of that web application details, and then the playbook will expect to add those in. You can set some defaults in some variables files alongside the playbook so that you can have can override things like here in the job template or on the command line, or in a lot of different other places. You can also set, as we saw a little bit ago, you can set variables on a particular host, on a whole group of hosts, or an entire could read those values as well. So if you had, HTTP port number set in development for all development machines to a certain value different than production, then you could easily just go into your inventory, find that set of machines, group them together, and then set a variable on that, on that group of machines. Just set a whole variable right there, like so, on this entire group. And Tower will pick that up from the group itself. So yeah, there are ways to abstract that. Next question: what kind of work is happening in between Azure and Ansible? Is it open source? Yes, absolutely. There is at least there's one module at the moment for Azure from Microsoft. It's right here. And if you go into GitHub, you will see the source of all of that. Everything that's here on docs.ansible.com, Ansible, is in the open source community. So you could go get the source of this Azure module. It's just a Python program. Microsoft and Ansible are both working on additional modules for Azure right at the moment as well. All of that happens in the open source community, so you can just follow along in GitHub. Next question: is it possible to specify Docker containers as hosts inside a playbook? Yes, absolutely. Docker and Ansible work very well together, and so you can specify Docker containers. There's also a set of Docker modules as well for Ansible, and the Docker modules allow you to do things like create Docker containers, create the images for a Docker container using the Docker image module, and then there's also a Docker module itself that allows you to do things like orchestrate Docker and launch containers and orchestrate changes to those as well. Looks like that's all the questions. Again, I am Dave at Ansible.com, so I am happy to follow up and answer any other questions that folks may have. If you want to reach out to me directly, happy to do so. Happy to take any questions that you have. I do encourage you to go out to Ansible.com. If you're already an Ansible user, then go to Ansible.com/Tower and check out Tower. Let us know if you need a longer trial or a better trial there. And then if you're not an Ansible user yet, go out to docs.ansible.com and get started here at Getting Started. There's a quick start video, and there's also just some very basic documentation about how to install Ansible and how to get started with it. And it'll really take you just minutes to hours to get started with it. So thanks so much for your time and your great questions today. I really appreciate all of the great conversation, and happy to work with you further. So again, Dave at Ansible.com, and thanks again.